They stripped her badge off in front of the entire ward. Security walked her out past the nurses' station, past the patients, past every colleague who watched and said nothing. Dr. Harlan Voss stood at the end of the hallway with his arms crossed, satisfied. The woman being removed had just saved a man's life using a call none of them understood. Nobody asked her how. Nobody said thank you. They handed her a cardboard box with her things, pointed at the exit, and closed the door behind her. 12 minutes later, 3 military helicopters descended on Callaway Regional Medical Center, and every soldier on board was looking for the nurse they just fired. If this story already has you hooked, I want you to follow my channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning had started the way most mornings did at Callaway Regional Medical Center. Understaffed, overloaded, and running about 40 minutes behind schedule before 9 o'clock even arrived. Delwood, Wyoming wasn't the kind of city that made the news for anything good. It sat in the high plains east of the Rockies, surrounded by mining operations, 2 overworked freight corridors, and a population that had been quietly shrinking for 15 years. Callaway Regional was the only major trauma facility within 60 miles, which meant it absorbed everything: ranch injuries, highway accidents, industrial incidents from the copper processing plant on Route 9, domestic situations that the ER staff had learned not to ask too many questions about. Rebecca Solis had worked there for 4 years. She was 38, lean in the way that people who never quite eat enough get lean, with dark circles she'd stopped trying to cover and short brown hair that she kept tucked behind her ears during shifts. On paper, she was a registered nurse assigned to the internal medicine floor. In the break room, she was the person other nurses came to when something didn't add up, when a number looked wrong, when a patient looked wrong, when the attending's order felt wrong, and nobody had the courage to say so out loud. She wasn't the kind of person who made speeches. She wasn't the kind who put certificates on walls or brought up her credentials in conversation. What she was, without anyone at Callaway knowing it, was someone who had spent 11 years in the United States Army as a trauma specialist, had done 2 tours in environments where the difference between the right call and the wrong one was measured in heartbeats, not liability forms. She'd been decorated 3 times. She'd been passed over for promotion once, under circumstances she didn't talk about, and then she'd resigned her commission quietly, moved somewhere nobody knew her name, and decided that saving lives in a civilian hospital was still saving lives. She didn't tell anyone any of that. There was no reason to. She was just a nurse now. That was what she wanted. But the morning of the incident started with a patient named Otto Garfield. Otto was 61, a maintenance supervisor at the processing plant, and he'd been admitted 2 days earlier complaining of chest tightness and what he described as the worst heartburn I've ever had in my life. The attending on his case, Dr. Marcus Tully, had ordered a standard cardiac workup and found nothing definitive. Troponin levels were slightly elevated, but within a range that Tully considered explainable. He'd written it off as stress-induced esophageal spasm, started Otto on a proton pump inhibitor, and scheduled him for discharge the following afternoon. Rebecca had checked on Otto during her 6 a.m. rounds. Something was off. She couldn't name it the way a textbook could, but she'd learned long before textbooks that the body communicates in ways that don't always translate cleanly into lab values. Otto's color wasn't right. His diaphoresis was subtle but present. He wasn't reporting pain, but he was holding himself in a way that suggested he was. The kind of stillness that meant someone was trying very hard not to move. She stood at the foot of his bed for a moment longer than she usually did. "Mr. Garfield, when you take a breath right now, does it pull anywhere?" He thought about it. "Maybe. Little bit. Right here." He touched a spot below his left shoulder blade. She ordered a repeat ECG without calling Tully first, which was technically within her authority and practically the kind of thing that could get you a formal conversation if the attending felt like pushing back. The ECG came back with a finding she recognized immediately: subtle ST segment changes in the inferior leads, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them, easy to dismiss if you were already committed to another diagnosis. She called Tully. He was not happy to be called. "His troponins were borderline, Rebecca. I've seen this pattern before. The man is 61 and stressed and working a 70-hour week. It might be a posterior STEMI, she said. The inferior changes together with the symptoms pattern. Are you telling me how to read an ECG? I'm telling you what I'm seeing in the patient. There was a pause. Chart it. I'll look at it when I'm done with the Watkins case. Dr. Tully, if I'm right, we don't have that window. Another pause, longer and colder. I said chart it. She charted it. She also, because she had learned certain things in certain places that no nursing program taught, pulled the portable crash cart closer to his room on her way down the hall. Not inside, just closer. A precaution nobody would notice. 22 minutes later, Otto Garfield coded. Rebecca was already at the door when the monitor alarmed. She was already gloved when the code team responded. She called the rhythm before anyone else reached the room. Ventricular fibrillation, which meant she was right about the heart, which meant the discharge plan had been 12 hours from killing him. The resuscitation took 9 minutes. It worked. Otto came back with sinus rhythm and a blood pressure that stabilized without vasopressors. She was still writing her notes at the nursing station when she heard the footsteps. Dr. Harlan Voss was not Otto Garfield's physician. He was the chief medical officer of Callaway Regional, which meant he occupied a position that was partly administrative and partly ceremonial, and partly the kind of institutional authority that made actual clinicians uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. He was 55, silver-haired in a way that photographed well, and he had the particular energy of a man who had not been directly responsible for a patient outcome in over a decade, but felt very strongly about the decisions of people who were. He was also, though Rebecca had no way of knowing this yet, a man with a problem. Ms. Solis, not nurse, not Rebecca. Ms. Solis, the way someone says a name when they've already made a decision and the conversation is just paperwork. She looked up. Beside him stood Nora Ingram, the floor's nurse manager, a woman Rebecca had always considered basically decent, which made what happened next more disorienting than it should have been. There's been a complaint, Voss said, regarding your conduct this morning in the Garfield case. The Garfield case. She kept her voice level. The patient I flagged for a posterior MSHOMI that we resuscitated 20 minutes ago. You ordered a diagnostic test without physician authorization. Nurses can order ECGs in this facility. That's in the protocol. And you interfered with Dr. Tully's treatment plan in a way that undermined clinical hierarchy and created confusion during a critical event. He said it like he'd rehearsed it, like the sentence had been written by someone else and handed to him. I created confusion, she said slowly. The code team reported that you were giving instructions that conflicted with the attending's approach. She set down her pen. The attending wasn't in the room. Voss didn't flinch. Dr. Tully is filing a formal complaint. Given the severity of the conduct and the pattern of behavior, pattern, she said. What pattern? Nora Ingram, to her credit, looked at the floor. We're placing you on immediate administrative suspension, pending investigation. Voss held out his hand, and Rebecca understood what he was waiting for. She unclipped her badge. She held it for exactly 1 second before setting it in his palm. She did not throw it, did not slam it, did not give him the satisfaction of any reaction he could characterize as emotional. Otto Garfield is alive, she said. And we're glad of that, Voss said. Security will escort you out. The walkout was the kind that people in hospitals talk about afterward. The ones who watched from the nursing station. The orderly who stepped aside in the hallway. The young resident who met her eyes for a moment and then looked away because he was 26 and not ready to attach his name to anything difficult. The patients in rooms with open doors who may or may not have understood what they were seeing. Rebecca walked out straight. She didn't look back. She kept her breathing even because she had learned in places far less comfortable than a Wyoming hospital hallway that the way you leave a room tells people more about you than you sometimes want to share. The morning air outside was cold and sharp and smelled like incoming weather. She stood in the parking lot with her cardboard box. They'd brought her things down, which meant this had been planned before they spoke to her, which meant this was never about this morning, and she tried to figure out what she actually felt. Not rage. Not exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous than rage. She'd been here before. The moment when an institution decides you're more useful as an example than as an asset. She knew what this was. She'd seen it in a different uniform, in a different country, and it had cost her more than a job that time. She set the box on the hood of her truck and looked up at the sky. The sky, she noticed, was the wrong color over the eastern ridge. Not clouds, not weather. The plume rising above the tree line was the dark, rolling kind that came from accelerant, thick and black at the base, spreading gray and brown as it climbed. She could see it clearly from the parking lot. Most people would have taken a second to identify what it was. She knew what it was in the first 2 seconds. She was already reaching back into the cardboard box for her trauma shears and her personal tourniquet. She carried both out of habit, had carried them every day since the first tour, when her phone buzzed. The emergency broadcast system. Industrial incident. Route 9 processing corridor. Multiple casualties. All available medical personnel. She read it once and put the phone back in her pocket. She stood there with the box in her hands and her badge gone and her suspension signed and filed, and she thought about getting in the truck and driving north. She thought about it for maybe 4 seconds. Then she put the box in the cab, locked the door, and walked back through the entrance of Callaway Regional Medical Center. The ER was already deteriorating when she arrived. She could hear it before she reached the department. The stacked triage alarms, the radio traffic from EMS units inbound, the specific pitch of a charge nurse trying to establish order in a room that had already outpaced the structure being imposed on it. She pushed through the doors. The waiting area had been cleared and was being staged for overflow. 2 ambulances had already arrived. She could see the paramedics offloading through the bay doors. A 3rd unit was backing in. The trauma bay had 1 patient and 3 people arguing about the approach. She didn't know the patient's condition, but she knew that 3 people arguing meant nobody was actually in charge. Nobody stopped her at the door. Nobody asked who she was or what she was doing there. In a mass casualty situation in a hospital without enough staff, a person who moves like they know what they're doing is a resource, not a question. She moved. "Trauma bay, give me a report," she said, and her voice was different now. Not the flat, careful voice she used on the floor, but something that had been trained into her by repetition and circumstance. The kind of voice that gets heard in environments where other voices are competing for space. 2 of the 3 people arguing looked at her. The 3rd was a second-year resident named Cade Mercer, who she recognized because he was the one who had looked away in the hallway. He hesitated. She didn't give him room to hesitate. "Adult male. What's the mechanism?" "Blast overpressure, they think." He was inside the facility. "GCS. 12 when he came in, dropping, 'Get me 2 large-bore IVs and a chest tray. What's his pressure?' 82 over palp. Tension pneumo presentation," she said, and she was already positioning because she could see it in his breathing. The tracheal deviation, subtle but present. The absent breath sounds on the left side that she could identify in about 3 seconds with a stethoscope. "Get me a 14 gauge and a primary IV set up, and tell me who your attending is right now." "Dr. Tully is where is he?" "Bay 3. "Someone go get him. Now." She looked at Cade Mercer directly. "You're with me. Do you know how to hold a field?" He blinked. Yes." "Then hold it." She worked the tension pneumothorax in the way she had worked it in places without electricity and proper equipment and a ceiling, with efficiency and without performance. The patient stabilized enough to move within 4 minutes. She had already reoriented to the incoming caseload before Mercer finished documenting. The ER charge nurse, a woman named Didi Flores, who had been at Callaway for 9 years and seen most everything, fell into step beside her. "You're suspended," Didi said quietly. "I know. Voss is going to—" "I know that too." She stopped at the triage board and looked at the incoming count. 8 patients listed, 4 more inbound. "Who's the most experienced attending on right now?" Didi looked at her for a moment. Then she answered. That was the thing about mass casualty events. They stripped away the politics. Not entirely, and not forever, but in the immediate term, the hierarchy that mattered was the one that could keep people alive. For the next 2 hours, Rebecca moved through Callaway Regional's emergency department the way she had moved through field stations in circumstances that made this one look orderly. She organized the triage flow. She redirected resources. She caught a medication error that would have crashed a patient with a head injury. She coached Cade Mercer through a procedure he'd only done twice before and watched him get it right. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain herself more than was necessary. She simply kept working. At one point, she passed Dr. Tully in the corridor, and he said nothing. At another point, she passed Nora Ingram, who had been pressed into service staffing a secondary intake area, and they looked at each other and Nora said quietly, "Rebecca." "Not now," Rebecca said and moved on. She didn't know who made the call. She didn't know if it was Dee Dee or one of the attendings, or the hospital administrator on duty who had been standing in the corner of the ER for 40 minutes, looking like a man trying to decide if he was watching something good or bad happen. She didn't know, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that at 11:14 in the morning, she heard the sound. She knew the sound before she identified it. It was in her nervous system before her brain caught up. The specific rotary thrum of military helicopters, more than one, and not the medevac configuration, not the civilian air ambulance she'd heard a dozen times over Delwood's hospital roof. This was different in weight and rhythm. She straightened up from the patient she was stabilizing and tilted her head. 3 aircraft. She counted the beats. Maybe 4. Dee Dee came around the corner with an expression Rebecca hadn't seen on her face before. "There are military helicopters on the roof." "How many?" 2 landed. 3rd is circling. Dee Dee paused. "They're asking for someone. They came in on the administrative channel, not the medical one. They're not here for the casualties." Rebecca went still. "Who are they asking for?" Dee Dee looked at her with the careful expression of someone delivering information they don't fully understand. "They're asking for you," she said. "By name. A general. He says he knows you." The elevator at the end of the corridor opened. He was in uniform, dress greens, which meant this was official and deliberate. He was 58, heavier than she remembered, with a scar along his jaw she'd watched him get in a situation neither of them had ever spoken about publicly. He had 3 stars on his shoulder and the kind of bearing that made the hospital corridor feel suddenly like a very different kind of room. He scanned the ER until he found her. And then Lieutenant General David Arroyo, who had been her commanding officer for 6 of the 11 years she spent in the Army, said her name the way people say names they've been rehearsing for a long time. Solis. The charge nurse, the residents, the orderlies, the administrator who had been lingering in the corner, every person in that corridor went quiet. Rebecca Solis, who had spent 4 years being invisible in this hospital, looked at the general who had come all the way to Delwood, Wyoming, with military aircraft and dress greens and a formality that meant the situation was very, very serious. She said, "Sir?" And behind her, she heard the sound of Harlan Voss's voice from the direction of the administrative corridor, asking someone what was happening. Nobody answered him. Nobody answered him, and that silence, the particular kind that happens when a room full of people all make the same decision at the same time without discussing it, said more than any of them could have put into words. General David Arroyo crossed the corridor with the deliberate stride of someone who had not come here to be brief, and the people in his path moved without being asked. That was the thing about certain kinds of authority. It didn't announce itself, it just arrived, and the room reorganized around it. He stopped 2 feet from Rebecca and looked at her the way you look at someone you've been trying to find. "You look like hell," he said. "It's been a morning," she said. Neither of them moved to shake hands or do anything ceremonial. That wasn't how they had ever operated, and 11 years of distance hadn't changed the baseline. He looked past her at the ER. The organized chaos she'd been managing for the last 2 hours. The triage flow that was still holding, barely, with a patient load that had pushed the department past its rated capacity 20 minutes ago. "You set this up," he said. "Nobody else was doing it." He nodded once, the kind of nod that means I expected that. Then he looked back at her, and something shifted in his expression. The operational assessment falling away, and something more complicated taking its place. "I need to talk to you somewhere that isn't here," he said. "I have patients. Your patients have doctors. This can't wait." She held his gaze for a moment. There were things she wanted to say, about timing, about the fact that she'd been escorted out of this building 3 hours ago and walked back in on her own terms and was now operating in a legal gray area that she hadn't fully worked out yet. She didn't say any of them. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She went back into the trauma bay and finished what she was doing. She gave Cade Mercer a handoff that covered everything she'd been tracking. The blast patient in Bay 1 who needed a recheck on his breath sounds in 30 minutes. The woman in Bay 4 with the questionable abdominal pressure readings. The teenager in the overflow area whose pain response didn't match his reported injury mechanism and needed someone to push on that. Mercer wrote it down. He was scared and trying not to show it, which meant he was paying attention, which was the most useful thing a resident in that situation could be. "You can do this," she told him. Not because it was what you said, but because she'd watched him work for 2 hours, and she meant it. He looked like he wanted to say something and didn't. She didn't wait for him to find it. Arroyo was standing near the ambulance bay when she came back. He'd moved away from the main corridor, which she understood. The conversation they were about to have was not for the general audience that had been watching them since the elevator opened. One of his aides, a young captain whose name she didn't know, was positioned near the door in a way that was clearly not casual. "We're not going to have this conversation in the hallway either," she said. "No," he agreed. "My team has the conference room on the second floor. Voss's people tried to block it and were informed that wasn't an option." She looked at him. "You cleared a room in his hospital." "It's not really his hospital at the moment." He said it plainly, like a fact. "Come on." The conference room had been a standard administrative meeting space 12 hours ago. Long table, projector screen, the kind of carpet that exists in every hospital in the country. Now it had 2 of Arroyo's staff working on laptops, a secure communications setup that had not been there before, and a stack of physical files on the table with a classification marking she recognized. She sat down across from him. She didn't ask where to start because there was only one place to start. "How long have you been looking for me?" "Actively? 7 months. Before that we knew where you were, but the situation didn't require contact." He paused. "That changed." "What situation?" He opened the top file and turned it so she could read the cover page. The header was a federal task force designation she didn't recognize, which meant it had been stood up after she left the service. Below it was a secondary header that she did recognize. It referenced a supply chain fraud investigation that had been opened during her 3rd year overseas, an investigation she had been the originating source for, an investigation that she had been told was closed after her departure. It was not closed. "They kept it going," she said. "A different team, different designating authority. The original case was buried, Bess. You know that. That's why you're here and not still in uniform. But the financial trail didn't stop. The people who buried it got sloppy, and about 18 months ago, a different set of investigators started pulling threads that led back to the original material." He leaned forward. "Which led back to you, and to what you documented before they pushed you out." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the conference room window, she could hear the hospital operating, the PA system, the distant alarm cadence, the machinery of a place trying to manage more than it was built for. "Why the helicopters?" she said. "Why the dress uniform? You could have called me." "I tried. 3 different contacts. You didn't respond." "I don't have the same number. I know that now." He looked at her steadily. "The dress uniform is because this is an official notification under the federal investigation, and I needed Voss to see it before I spoke to you. There's a reason for that." She went still. "What kind of reason?" He turned another page in the file. Harlan Voss. Prior to taking the CMO position at Callaway Regional, he was a consultant for Meridian Defense Partners, medical logistics and supply chain management for military contracts. The name landed on her like something cold. She knew Meridian. She'd been the one who first documented the discrepancies in their billing records, inflated invoices, substituted materials, a scheme that had moved tens of millions of dollars in overcharges through defense medical contracts over 6 years. She'd handed that documentation to her commanding officer at the time. Her commanding officer had told her the matter was under review. 3 months later, she was out. "He's connected to Meridian," she said. "Was connected. Present tense may also apply. The investigation is still working through the financial architecture." Arroyo's jaw set. "What we know is that Voss was brought into Callaway Regional 2 years ago. His appointment was facilitated by 2 members of the hospital board who have ties to the same contractor network. And 7 months ago, a report was flagged to our task force. Someone at this hospital was accessing federal medical procurement databases in a way that suggested data collection. She understood then why he'd needed her to see the file before he explained anything. If she'd just heard the words, she might have found a way to make it smaller than it was. She couldn't make this smaller. "They knew I was here," she said. "We believe so, yes. The suspension this morning may not have been only about this morning." He said it carefully, watching her face. "That's what we're trying to determine." She sat with that for a long moment. She'd been telling herself since the parking lot that the suspension was institutional politics. Tully's ego, Voss's need to demonstrate authority, the ordinary machinery of a hospital culture that didn't like being challenged. That had made it manageable. That had kept it in a box she understood. This took it out of the box. "I need to know something," she said. "Ask." Is Callaway Regional a target of the investigation, or is it a venue being used by people who are targets of the investigation? He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind. "Both possibilities are active," he said finally. "We don't know yet how far the contamination goes. That's part of why we're here in person." "And the explosion this morning? The plant on Route 9? He paused. "That's under separate investigation. We don't have a confirmed connection, but we're not ruling it out." She looked at him. "You're not ruling out that the industrial explosion that sent 40-some casualties to this hospital on the same morning I was suspended was a coincidence?" "I'm not ruling anything out," he said. "Neither should you." She stood up. She needed to move, even just to the window. Sitting still when information was reordering, everything felt wrong in her body. Always had. She looked out at the parking lot below. A news van had arrived at some point in the last hour and was parked near the main entrance. 2 police cruisers, another military vehicle she hadn't seen before. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Formally, I need your cooperation with the investigation. I need a statement regarding your original documentation of the Meridian irregularities and the events that led to your separation." He paused. "Informally," and here his voice changed slightly, the formality dropping a layer. "I need you to understand what you walked back into this morning." "I walked back in because people were dying." "I know, that's who you are. It's also why you're not safe right now." She turned from the window. "Define not safe." "The people in this network have demonstrated a willingness to damage careers, manipulate records, and use institutional authority as a weapon. They did it to you once. If Voss understands what's happening, he's going to understand very quickly," she said. "You walked through his ER with the stars on the collar and a security team and cleared a room in his hospital. He's not a stupid man." "No," Arroyo agreed. "He's not." "So what happens now?" He looked at her directly. "You go back to work." She blinked. "I'm suspended." "As of 40 minutes ago, your suspension has been stayed by federal order pending the outcome of the investigation. The paperwork is being delivered to Voss's office right now." He said it without any particular satisfaction, which was the only way she could have accepted it. "This isn't reinstatement. It's a hold. Your status is temporarily protected because you are a material witness in an active federal investigation, and your removal from this facility at this specific moment is not in the interest of that investigation." "You need me visible," she said. "I need you doing exactly what you were doing when I walked off that elevator." "Yes." She processed that. There was something deeply uncomfortable about being used as a piece on someone else's board, even if the board's objective was something she'd spent 11 years waiting to see happen. She'd been moved around enough times by enough people with enough stars on their shoulders to know that the intentions of the person moving the piece didn't change the experience of being the piece. But the patients in the ER were real. The man she'd resuscitated this morning was real. The young resident she'd left downstairs trying to hold together a mass casualty flow was real. "Fine," she said, "but I work my way." "You always have," Arroyo said, and she couldn't quite tell if it was a compliment or a complaint. She left the conference room and went back downstairs. The thing about a mass casualty situation is that it doesn't pause for the complications of the people managing it. The ER had not resolved itself during the 40 minutes she'd been upstairs. If anything, the secondary wave had arrived. The less critical patients who hadn't been brought in by ambulance but had driven themselves or been brought by family, the walking injured who were frightened and hurting and needed triage at a level that the overwhelmed department wasn't giving them. She found Cade Mercer at the nursing station, looking at 3 things simultaneously and clearly not sure which one was most urgent. "The woman in Bay 4?" she said. Her pressure dropped. "I pushed fluids. Get a surgical consult right now. Don't ask, tell them it's urgent, and if they give you friction, call it a mass casualty priority." Which it is. She was already moving. The teenager? He finally admitted, "It's not a blast injury. He fell before the evacuation. He was embarrassed." "Okay, orthopedic issue only? Looks like it. I've got him flagged for X-ray." "Good." She stopped. "You held this together." Mercer looked at her with the expression of someone who'd just put down something very heavy. "I didn't. It's still—" "I know," she said. "You held it together anyway. That's what it looks like." She didn't have time to watch him absorb that. She was already across the room. Didi Flores was managing intake with the exhausted competence of someone who had done this before and would do it again and had permanently stopped pretending it wasn't hard. She looked up when Rebecca approached. "Federal paperwork came through," Didi said quietly. "Voss got it about 20 minutes ago." "How'd that go?" "I wasn't in the room, but I heard him in the hallway after. He was on his phone." She paused. "He didn't sound happy." "He's not going to be happy for a while," Rebecca said. Didi studied her for a moment. "You want to tell me what's actually happening?" "Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending on how things go." "That's what I figured." Didi handed her a patient chart. Bay 6. Blast patient, 47, hypotensive on arrival, now stable, but his lung sounds are getting worse. "I've been watching him, but I've got him," Rebecca said and moved. The next hour was medicine. That was the only word for it. The grinding, imperfect, constantly adjusting work of keeping a department functioning when it was running 20% over capacity with staff who had been on shift since before the incident and were now hitting the part of their shifts where mistakes start happening because human beings aren't machines, even the excellent ones. She made the call to transfer 2 patients to the regional trauma center 60 miles north. It wasn't the ideal choice. The road was long and weather was moving in, but holding them in a compromised facility was worse, and she'd learned to make the bad option that was better than the worse option without spending too long grieving the good option that wasn't available. She walked the charge nurse through the transfer protocol. She caught a dosing error on a chart that would have been a serious problem in 6 hours. She sat with a 40-year-old plant worker named Gus, who was going to lose a finger and was more upset about telling his wife than about the finger itself, and she talked to him for 3 minutes because 3 minutes was what it cost, and he needed it. She was coming out of Gus's room when she saw Voss. He was standing at the end of the main corridor with the precise stillness of a man who was very angry and was making a calculated choice about how to express it. He was alone, which meant he'd come without backup, which meant this was personal before it was institutional. She walked toward him, not at him, toward him because the nursing station was in that direction and she wasn't going to change her route for his body language. He waited until she was close. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Mr. Voss," she said, and she used Mr. deliberately and watched him register it. "I'm in the middle of a shift. If you have something for me, put it in writing. You think you understand what's happening here." His voice was very controlled. "You don't. I understand there are 40-some patients in this department who need medical care, and I'm one of the people providing it." She stopped, looked at him. "Is that all?" Something moved across his face, not quite fear, but its neighbor. He said nothing. She went back to work. It was another 40 minutes before the next disruption arrived, and it arrived in the form of a woman she'd never seen before. She was mid-40s, compact, with the kind of haircut that read as functional rather than chosen, and she was wearing a jacket that didn't quite conceal the badge at her waist. She came through the ER's staff entrance, not the public entrance, the staff entrance, which meant she had either authorization or the kind of confidence that substitutes for it. She found Rebecca at the nursing station and introduced herself in a voice pitched for the 2 of them. "Special Agent Diane Fossey. I'm with the task force." Rebecca kept her eyes on the chart she was annotating. "You have timing." "We usually do." Fossey stood beside her, not opposite, not confrontational. The general briefed you upstairs. He did. Then you know we're going to need your access to certain things in this building. Rebecca looked up at that. What kind of access? Fossey glanced around the nursing station. 2 nurses at the far end, Mercer heading away toward Bay 2. Patient scheduling records for the last 8 months, specifically intake records for patients with military or federal insurance designations. That's not my access level. You have nurse-level access to the system. We need someone with legitimate clinical credentials to pull records without triggering the administrative audit alert that fires when we access it directly. She paused. It's a technical workaround. It's authorized. By who? Fossey told her, and named a federal authority that was above the task force and significantly above the hospital and significantly above Harlan Voss. Rebecca thought about what Arroyo had said, the contamination, how far it went, the question of whether this hospital was a target or a venue. What am I looking for? She said. You'll know it when you see it, Fossey said. I'll be standing right here. It took Rebecca 11 minutes to pull the records Fossey needed, working through the standard clinical interface that she'd used hundreds of times without thinking about it. She pulled intake logs, cross-referenced the insurance designation filter, and printed a physical output because Fossey had specifically said physical. She handed Fossey the printout. Fossey scanned it. Her expression didn't change in any dramatic way. It just became more focused, the way a face gets when something that was a theory becomes a fact. Okay, Fossey said quietly. Okay. What is it? Fossey folded the printout and put it in her jacket. I need to make a call. Stay available. She walked away toward the staff entrance. Rebecca stood at the nursing station. The ER moved around her. The alarms, the voices, the mechanical rhythm of a place doing what it was built to do. She looked at the computer screen where the records had been opened 30 seconds ago, now closed and logged out. She was thinking about the patient scheduling records, about which patients had federal insurance designations, about the specific months Fossey had asked about what someone running a data collection operation inside a hospital would want with that information, about the fact that 7 months ago, someone at Callaway Regional had been accessing federal procurement databases, about the fact that she had been at Callaway Regional for 4 years, about the fact that, for at least part of that time, the wrong people had known exactly where she was. She heard raised voices from the direction of the administrative corridor. Not argument level, confrontation level. She didn't move toward it immediately. She gave it 10 seconds, because sometimes confrontation-level voices resolve on their own, and she had learned not to spend herself on every alarm that might not need her. At second 11, Cade Mercer came around the corner at a pace that wasn't quite running but was adjacent to it. There's something happening in the administrative wing, he said. Voss and the federal agents, they're... He stopped. There are more agents. I don't know where they came from. A lot more. She looked toward the administrative corridor. She'd known this moment was coming. She'd known it in the parking lot, known it in the conference room with Arroyo, known it in the way Voss had looked at her 20 minutes ago with something adjacent to fear behind his controlled expression. She started moving. The administrative wing at Callaway Regional occupied the eastern corridor on the ground floor, a stretch of offices and conference rooms that most clinical staff visited only for HR purposes or mandatory meetings. She'd been down this hallway maybe a dozen times in 4 years. She heard it before she reached the corner. You don't have the authority. Voss's voice still controlled but losing its shape around the edges. Sir, I need you to step back. A voice she didn't recognize. Flat, professional, the specific cadence of law enforcement in an enforcement moment. She came around the corner. Voss was standing in the doorway of his own office with 2 federal agents on either side of him and a third visible through the office window, moving through the room with the purposeful, unhurried pace of someone executing a warrant. Nora Ingram was in the hallway with her hand over her mouth. 2 other administrative staff were flattened against the wall, watching with the specific expression of people who don't know if they're witnesses or suspects. Fossey was there. She was on a phone, talking quietly. She glanced at Rebecca when she appeared. Voss saw Rebecca at the same moment. Something happened in his face that she'd never seen before. Not anger, Not the controlled superiority that had been his register for as long as she'd known him, something rawer than that. "You did this," he said. "Mr. Voss," one of the agents said. "She did this." He pointed at her, and his voice was no longer controlled. "She has no idea what she's involved in. She thinks she doesn't understand what she walked into when she came here." The agent stepped in front of him, not roughly, but with the finality of a door closing. "Sir, inside!" Voss disappeared into his office with the agents, and the door closed, and the hallway was very quiet. Nora Ingram was staring at Rebecca. Her face was difficult to read. Some combination of shock and something else, something that looked, if Rebecca was reading it right, like relief, which didn't make sense yet. "Nora," Rebecca said, "are you all right?" Nora opened her mouth, closed it. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "I've been needing to tell you for a long time." Rebecca looked at her, the agent near the door, the office where Voss had disappeared, the warrant she hadn't seen but knew was there. "Come on," she said to Nora. "Not here." They found an empty consultation room at the end of the corridor, and Nora closed the door behind them, and in the small quiet of that room, with the sounds of the warrant execution muffled behind two walls, Nora Ingram sat down and said the things she'd been carrying. "I reported you," she said, "to Voss, not this morning, 8 months ago, when you asked questions about the procurement records." Rebecca went very still. "You were asking about the supply discrepancies, the equipment billing. You didn't ask me directly, but I saw what you were pulling, and Voss had told me—" Her voice broke at the edge. "He told me you were a disruptive employee, and he needed to know if you were accessing records outside your scope. He said it was a performance issue. I thought it was a performance issue." The room was quiet. 8 months. The timeline Arroyo had referenced, 7 months. Someone accessing federal databases. The decision to activate the task force. The timeline matched. "He used you to track me," Rebecca said. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't know." She said it and meant it, because Nora's face had the particular look of someone who had been a tool without understanding they were being held. "Did you tell anyone else before today?" "No, after this morning, after I watched them walk you out, Nora pressed her hands flat on the table. "I almost went to the parking lot to find you." "But you didn't." "I was scared." Rebecca nodded. That was honest, at least. Fear was honest. "You need to talk to Agent Fossey," she said. "Everything you just told me, you tell her. Exactly." "Will I—" Nora stopped. "Am I in trouble?" Rebecca looked at her. "I don't know," she said, because she didn't, and lying about it would have been worse than the uncertainty. "Tell the truth. That's the only thing that helps you now." She left Nora in the consultation room and walked back into the corridor. Fossey was off her phone when Rebecca emerged. She turned, took one look at Rebecca's face, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "What?" "You need to talk to Nora Ingram," Rebecca said. "Nurse manager, room at the end of the hall." Fossey looked at her for a moment. "What did she tell you?" "She'll tell you herself," Rebecca said. "She needs to say it to someone who can do something with it." Fossey studied her with the appraising look of someone recalibrating. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" "I'm not here to make your case," Rebecca said. "I'm here because my patients need me. Those are different things." Fossey almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. "Fair enough," she said, and moved toward the end of the corridor. Rebecca turned and walked back toward the ER. She was halfway down the main corridor, moving toward the sound of the department and the work that was still waiting for her, when her phone buzzed. Not the hospital line. Her personal cell, which almost nobody had. She stopped, looked at the screen. Unknown number. Wyoming area code. She answered it. Static, and then a voice, male, young, and frightened in a way that sounded specific rather than general, the fear of someone who knew exactly what they were afraid of. "Is this Rebecca Solis?" the voice said. "Who's asking?" "My name is Tevin Marsh. I worked at the Route 9 facility." A pause. "I need to talk to someone who isn't them. I saw something this morning, before the explosion." Her hand tightened on the phone. Before, she said. Yes, Tevin Marsh said. Before. Before, Tevin Marsh said again, and the word had a weight to it that made Rebecca's next breath come slower. She looked down the corridor. Fosse had disappeared into the consultation room with Nora Ingram. The two agents near Voss's office were occupied. Nobody was watching her. Where are you right now? She said. My truck. I don't know, I just drove away from there. I'm on the 287, I think, north of the facility. Are you injured? No, I got out before I wasn't inside when it went. A pause. Some guys weren't that lucky. She registered that and kept moving. Tevin, you said you saw something before the explosion. Tell me what you saw. I need to know who you are first. Someone gave me your number, said you were the person to call. Who gave you my number? A guy named Darnell who works transport at the hospital. He said you were the one who actually helped people this morning. The nurse who came back. Darnell from transport. She knew him. Broad-shouldered, 50-something, had a daughter in college, and kept pictures of her in his locker. She'd helped him navigate his mother's discharge paperwork 2 years ago. She hadn't thought about that in months. Okay, she said. I'm Rebecca Solis. I'm a nurse at Callaway Regional. I'm also... She stopped, made a decision. I'm also someone with a federal investigation team on site right now who needs to hear whatever you have. Will you come in? Silence on the line. The particular silence of someone weighing options, running scenarios. The people I saw this morning, Tevin said slowly, they weren't plant workers. What do you mean? I mean, they were at the facility, but they weren't there for the job. They were in the restricted access area, the chemical storage corridor, and they had equipment that our people don't use. I don't know what it was, but I've worked that plant for 6 years, and I know what belongs there and what doesn't. She kept her voice even. How long before the explosion? Maybe 40 minutes, maybe less. I almost said something to my supervisor, but he wasn't. He wasn't around that morning, which was also unusual. He paused. Ms. Solis, I've been sitting in this truck for 3 hours trying to figure out who I can trust, because the first person I called was my shift foreman, and he didn't answer, and the second person I called was the plant emergency line, and that went to voicemail, and that has never in 6 years gone to voicemail. Rebecca turned and walked quickly back toward the administrative wing. Don't call anyone else, she said. Don't drive anywhere. Stay on the 287. I'm going to send someone to you within the next 20 minutes. Will you wait? Yeah, he said, and he sounded like a man who had been holding something very heavy and had just been given permission to set it down temporarily. Yeah, I'll wait. She ended the call and pushed through the consultation room door without knocking. Fosse looked up. Nora Ingram flinched. I need you outside, Rebecca said to Fosse. Now. Fosse read her face and stood up in one motion. She said something brief to Nora, stay here, and came into the corridor. Rebecca told her about Tevin Marsh in 60 seconds, without editorializing. Fosse's expression didn't change, but her eyes got very focused, the kind of focus that meant processing rather than reaction. Unknown personnel in the restricted chemical storage area, 40 minutes pre-explosion, Fosse repeated. That's what he said. And the plant emergency line went to voicemail. Yes. Fosse was already on her phone. She turned slightly away, spoke in the low, urgent shorthand of someone relaying intelligence to a team. She listened, said 3 words Rebecca couldn't hear, listened again. She turned back. I'm sending a car to his location right now. You said 287 north of the facility? That's what he said? Good. Fosse looked at her with an expression that had shifted. This changes the scope. I know, Rebecca said. How much? That depends on what Marsh saw. If there were outside actors in that facility, we're not looking at a fraud case with a collateral explosion. We're looking at something bigger. The words landed with the particular weight of facts that changed the shape of a room. Rebecca had understood, somewhere in the back of her awareness since Arroyo sat across from her and said he wasn't ruling anything out, that this might be where it went. Understanding it conceptually and hearing a federal agent say it out loud were not the same experience. The patients from the explosion, she said, they're still in my ER. I know. If the explosion was deliberate, if the people who said it had any reason to believe witnesses survived, I have 2 agents in the ER right now, Fossey said. They've been there since we arrived. I put them there as a precaution. She paused. This is why Arroyo wanted you visible and working. The ER is where the witnesses are. You're the person they'll talk to. Rebecca processed that. She had been a piece on a board since the moment she walked back through those doors. She'd known it, had made her peace with it. But the board was larger than she'd estimated, and the game being played on it was something she hadn't fully mapped yet. I need to get back to the department, she said. Go, Fossey said. And Solis, she stopped her with a hand not quite touching her arm. Be careful who you speak to about this. Until we know the full network inside this facility, everyone is provisional. Everyone, Rebecca said. Everyone. She went back to the ER. The department had crossed from acute chaos into the exhausted functional rhythm that a mass casualty event settles into after the first several hours. The frantic pace replaced by something steadier and grimmer, people working with the focused, diminished energy of a second wind that everyone knows isn't going to last. The patient count in the department had peaked and was now slowly declining as transfers moved out and the walking wounded were assessed and discharged or held. The blast patients who remained were the ones who were going to be there for days. She did a full round. Every patient, every chart, every face. It was something she'd done at the end of every shift for 4 years. Not protocol, not required, just something she'd started doing after the first tour because she'd learned that the moment you stop looking at patients as individuals and start seeing them as case numbers was the moment you started missing things. Gus, the finger patient, was asleep. A young woman named Petra, who'd been caught in the outer perimeter of the blast, was awake and asking about her husband, who was 3 bays away and, Rebecca could tell her honestly, was stable and going to stay that way. An older man whose name she couldn't see on the chart at first angle, she tilted it. Rogelio Ferry's 64, blast and smoke inhalation, whose oxygen sat was holding but whose anxiety was clearly climbing. She stayed with him 3 minutes longer than she needed to clinically, because he was the kind of frightened that benefits from a real human being standing in the room rather than popping in and out. The worst of it's over for you, she told him. Your lungs are responding well. What happened out there? He said. His voice was rough from the smoke. Explosion at the facility. You're safe here. I heard people saying... He stopped, coughed. They're saying it wasn't an accident. She looked at him steadily. Where'd you hear that? Guy in the bay next door. He works transport at the plant. Young guy, real shook up. She went very still, then she said calmly, Rest. I'll check back in 30 minutes. She stepped out of the bay and walked directly to the one next door. The young man sitting upright on the bed was not someone she recognized as a patient she'd seen before. He was maybe 23, slight, with a bandaged forearm and the wide-eyed stillness of someone who had recently been through something and was still running on adrenaline. His intake tag read, Marcus Obi, plant laborer, soft tissue laceration from debris. Not Tevin Marsh, a different plant worker, one who apparently had been talking. She assessed him quickly. Marcus, I'm Rebecca. I'm one of the nurses. How's the arm feeling? It's fine, he said, which probably wasn't accurate but wasn't her immediate concern. Is it true what I said? Is it not an accident? Where did you get that idea? I heard 2 guys talking in the waiting area before I came back here. I don't know who they were. They weren't plant workers. I know everybody there. These guys I'd never seen. They were talking about a crew and a timer and whether enough time had... He stopped. I moved away because it felt wrong, and then like 20 minutes later my name got called for the bay, and I've been in here since. 2 men she didn't recognize. In the waiting area, talking about a timer. When was this? She said. Maybe 2 hours ago, 2.5. 2 hours ago she'd been in the middle of managing the acute phase of the mass casualty intake. She hadn't been in the waiting area. Nobody assigned to clinical care had been. The waiting area management had fallen to an administrative volunteer and a registration clerk. She kept her face neutral. Are they still out there, do you think? I don't know. I didn't want to look. Okay, you did the right thing. I'm going to get someone to come talk to you. Is that all right? Am I in trouble? No, she said. You're a witness, which is different. She stepped out of the bay and as she did, she pulled out her phone and typed a single text to the number Fosse had given her before she walked away from the administrative corridor. 2 unknown males, waiting area, approximately 2 to 2.5 hours ago. Witness in Bay 7. Come now. Fosse's response came in under 30 seconds. On it. Do not approach them if still present. She didn't intend to approach them. She wasn't a federal agent, wasn't armed, wasn't operating under any authority beyond her reinstated clinical credentials and whatever the federal stay on her suspension technically covered. She understood her lane. She also understood that the waiting area had a sight line from the nurses' station, and she had a legitimate reason to be at the nurses' station. Dee Dee was there. Chart situation on Ferris, Rebecca said, settling in beside her with a tablet in a way that looked entirely ordinary. Dee Dee handed her the chart without comment. Sightseeing, she said quietly, because 9 years in an ER teaches you to read subtext. Just charting, Rebecca said. She looked up once. The waiting area was visible through the glass partition at the end of the station. Maybe 20 people sitting, standing, a few clustered near the vending machines. Most looked like family members waiting on news. None of them immediately read as the configuration Marcus Obi had described. She looked back at the chart. Fosse came through the staff entrance 4 minutes later with one of her agents. They moved through the waiting area in the particular way that federal agents move when they are assessing rather than arresting, covering the room systematically, stopping to speak to a few individuals, looking like they might be asking administrative questions. 2 minutes after that, Fosse reappeared at the nursing station window and met Rebecca's eyes through the glass. She shook her head slightly. Gone. Already gone. Which meant they'd left on their own, possibly before Rebecca had even spoken to Marcus. Which meant someone had decided the waiting area wasn't safe anymore. Which meant someone had a reason to think the situation was evolving faster than expected. She set the chart down. Thought about what she knew. Unidentified personnel in the chemical storage corridor 40 minutes before the explosion. Unidentified men in the hospital waiting area 2 hours after the explosion, discussing a crew and a timer. Rogelio Ferris's oxygen sat, which she checked again on the monitor feed at the station, was holding. Tevin Marsh was on the 287 waiting for a car. She thought about Voss, the office, the warrant, the look on his face when he'd pointed at her and said, "You did this." She'd been reading it as anger. She was now less certain it was only anger. She was turning this over when Cade Mercer appeared beside her. He had the look he got when there was something clinical he needed to say and wasn't sure how she'd receive it. She'd learned to recognize the look in the last 6 hours. "Bay 3, he said. "The blast patient from the inner perimeter. Yusuf Adara, 41. His pressure's been trending down for the last 20 minutes. I've been watching it and it's not responding to the fluid rate I have him on." She was already moving. "Walk me through what you've got." "Abdomen is distending. I think it might be internal hemorrhage." She pushed through the bay curtain. Adara was conscious, but barely. The gray pallor of inadequate perfusion, the distended abdomen that Mercer had correctly flagged, blood pressure 78/40 on the monitor. "How long has the distension been visible?" "I first noticed it maybe 40 minutes ago, but it was subtle." "Surgical team," she said. "Right now. Not a page, a call, direct line. Tell them we have an acute abdomen with hemodynamic instability and they need to be here in 5 minutes." She was already establishing a second IV access because one was not enough for what was likely coming. "Get me 2 units of O negative from the blood bank and don't wait for the cross-match. We don't have time." Mercer went. She worked. The thing about internal hemorrhage in a blast patient was that it could hide. The abdomen absorbed blood slowly, and the pressure drop could lag behind the actual rate of loss. And by the time it became visually obvious, you were already behind the curve. She'd seen it in the field in patients who looked stable for an hour and then crashed inside of 10 minutes. She talked to Adara while she worked. He was a plant worker, had been near the secondary blast zone, had a wife whose name was on his intake form, Delia, and a son whose name she didn't know because the form only had one emergency contact field. She didn't tell him any of that. She said things like, "Stay with me, and I've got you," because those were the honest things. The surgical team arrived in 4 minutes, which was fast for a hospital this size and this overwhelmed. The attending surgeon, a woman named Dr. Priya Tanaka, who Rebecca had worked with exactly once before and found competent and no nonsense, assessed the abdomen in 30 seconds and made the call. "He needs an OR," Tanaka said. "I know." "Is there one available?" Rebecca looked at Tanaka. "That's your department." "I'm asking because I've been in an OR for 6 hours with a bowel resection that wasn't supposed to take 6 hours, and I'm not entirely sure what state the rest of the surgical suite is in." "Then find out," Rebecca said, not unkindly, "and find out fast." Tanaka found out. There was one OR available. Adara was moving within 8 minutes of Rebecca's initial call. She stood in the corridor and watched the gurney go and thought about all the places she'd stood in corridors and watched gurneys go, and how that particular feeling, the handing off, the letting go of the clinical moment, never quite became ordinary no matter how many times you experienced it. Mercer came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything, which was correct. After a moment, she said, "Good catch." "I almost missed it," he said. "But you didn't." He was quiet. Then, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "The military people, the agents, is this—" He seemed to be searching for the right framing. "Is this going to be like a news story? Are we going to be on the news?" She looked at him. He was 26 and scared and had just had a genuinely good day, clinically in the worst possible circumstances, and didn't entirely know how to hold all of it at the same time. "Probably," she said. "Yes." "About the hospital? About Voss?" "Among other things." He absorbed that. He wasn't... I knew he was difficult. I didn't know he was... Neither did most people, she said. That's usually how it works. She left him with that and went back to the station. The next hour moved differently than the previous hours had. The acute pressure had dropped enough that the department was no longer running on crisis energy, and what replaced it was the particular exhausted lucidity that comes when a system has been pushed to its limit and hasn't broken. People were talking more, eating things from the vending machines, sitting down for the first time in hours. She kept moving. Not because she needed to perform busyness, but because sitting down felt wrong when there were still things to watch. It was Fossey who found her again, at 3:15 in the afternoon. "Tevin Marsh is in a federal vehicle," Fossey said. "His account is consistent with what he told you on the phone. Consistent and specific. He described the equipment configuration in the storage corridor in enough detail that our explosives team had a preliminary identification within 20 minutes of his interview." Rebecca looked at her. "Preliminary identification of what?" "Incendiary device components," Fossey said. "Not an accident, not an equipment malfunction. Deliberate." The words sat in the air between them. "Whose?" Rebecca said. "That's the question we're answering right now." Fossey looked at her directly. "We found something else in the records you pulled this morning." "What kind of something?" "A patient intake record. Military insurance designation. The patient was admitted for a minor procedure 8 months ago, routine, nothing unusual, except the intake notes were flagged in the system by someone who doesn't appear in the staff directory." "Flagged how?" "A notation that references a case number. A case number that corresponds to an internal Meridian defense audit that was never made public. That audit was the first internal document to name you, by your old rank, as the source of the original procurement fraud report." The room was very quiet. "Someone inside this hospital accessed that audit," Rebecca said, "and attached the case number to your patient intake record, which would have created a linkage in their internal tracking system. A linkage that would tell anyone monitoring that network that you were here, in Delwood, at Callaway Regional." Fossey's voice was precise. "This is how they found you 8 months ago. This is how they've been watching you." She'd known. She'd already known. In the parking lot, in the conference room with Arroyo. She'd been building toward knowing this since the moment Fossey asked her to pull those records. But there was a difference between building toward a truth and arriving at it, and she was arriving at it now, in a hospital corridor in Wyoming, on a day that had started with her being walked out of a building and had turned into something she didn't yet have the full shape of. "Voss," she said. "We believe Voss created the linkage. We're still confirming." Fossey paused. But there's a second name in the notation. Rebecca waited. Someone else flagged it. A secondary annotation 3 weeks after the original. The second person noted that you were asking questions about procurement, about billing discrepancies. Fossey held her gaze. That annotation matches a user credential for a nurse manager on the internal medicine floor. Nora Ingram. Rebecca thought about the consultation room. The way Nora had said I reported you, the way her face had looked, not like someone who was afraid of consequences, but like someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had reached the limit of the carrying. She told me she reported me, Rebecca said. She thought it was a performance issue. She didn't know what Voss was using the information for. That's consistent with what she told me, Fossey said. But her credential is in the system regardless, which creates a legal complication. For Nora. Yes. Rebecca thought about this. There was something frustrating about the way systems worked, the way the person who had been a small tool in a large machine could end up bearing the same documentary weight as the person who built and operated the machine. Nora had made a mistake, and the mistake had real consequences, but the architecture of malice behind it had been built by people with significantly more power and purpose. She said so, less carefully than she might have. Fossey listened. I understand that perspective, she said. I don't determine prosecutorial outcomes. I know, Rebecca said. I'm not asking you to. She walked away from that conversation feeling the specific fatigue of a day that had been too many things at once. Clinical, investigative, personal, institutional. She was tired in the way that goes deeper than sleep can easily reach. She was passing the entrance to the administrative wing when she heard the sound. Not loud, not alarming, by the ordinary measure of a hospital. A thump from behind a closed door. The door to the secondary conference room, not the one Arroyo's team had commandeered. The smaller one near the HR suite that she'd never had reason to use. She stopped. She stood in the corridor and heard it again. Not a thump. More like something shifting, something heavy. She looked at the door. Standard hospital door handle rather than key card, closed but probably not locked. There was no light visible under it. She was tired and the day had been long, and Fossey had specifically told her not to approach situations independently, and she was a nurse, not an agent, and she knew all of this. She opened the door anyway. The room was dark except for the light from the corridor entering behind her. The secondary conference table, 4 chairs, a projector that hadn't been used in months, a window on the far wall, blinds drawn. A man was in the corner of the room, on the floor, his back against the wall, not unconscious. He looked up when the light hit him. She recognized him in the first second, even though she'd only seen him twice, and the second time had been on a gurney in the ER 7 hours ago, and even though he looked significantly worse now than he had then. It was Dr. Marcus Tully. His white coat was gone. His face had the tight, compressed look of someone in sustained pain. His right arm was held against his body in a way that suggested it was injured, not immobilized. He had a laceration on his forehead that had been bleeding and had partially dried. He looked at her. Solis, he said. And then, in a voice she had never heard from him in 4 years of working alongside him, low and stripped of everything she associated with him, the confidence and the dismissal and the hierarchy, he said, I need your help. She stood in the doorway. The Marcus Tully who had been on the phone with her this morning about Otto Garfield's ECG, who had filed a complaint against her, who had watched her get suspended and said nothing, who was connected somehow to a network she didn't yet fully understand. That man was sitting on the floor of a dark conference room with a bleeding head wound and a voice that sounded like something had broken inside it. What happened to you? She said. I tried to get out, he said. This afternoon, after the agents came. I went to my car and 2 men were waiting and they... He stopped, breathed. I managed to get back inside, but I haven't been able to reach anyone, and I don't know who's... The 2 men, she said. Describe them. He described them in the shaking, imprecise way of someone who had been frightened rather than trained to observe. But what he described matched. Height, build, the specific kind of nondescript clothing that people wear when they don't want to be memorable. The waiting area. Marcus Obi had said 2 men. Now they'd apparently been outside the hospital too, in the parking structure, waiting for someone. waiting for Tully. Which meant Tully was not simply a corrupt physician. He was also, at some level, a liability to the people who had used him. She made a decision. She took out her phone and called Fossey directly. She didn't text this time. "I found Marcus Tully," she said when Fossey picked up. "Secondary conference room, administrative wing. He's injured and he says he was confronted by two men in the parking structure who matched the description from the waiting area." Silence on the line for exactly 2 seconds. "Do not leave that room," Fossey said. "I'm coming to you." She put the phone in her pocket and looked at Tully. "Agents are coming," she said. He nodded. He looked at her with the expression of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to do. "I can tell them everything," he said. "I have records. I've kept records for 2 years because I—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I knew eventually I'd need them. I just didn't think it would be—" "Don't tell me," she said. "Tell them." She didn't move toward him, didn't offer comfort she didn't have the capacity for, didn't tell him it was going to be fine because she didn't know if it was. She stood in the doorway and kept watch and listened to the hospital around her and waited. She was still standing there when the lights in the corridor went out. Not a flicker, not a partial failure, all of them. The entire administrative wing, the emergency lighting kicking on a second later in the dull red of backup power, the hospital's primary grid cutting to secondary with the mechanical clunk she recognized from the generator protocol. From somewhere deep in the building, an alarm began to sound. Not a patient alarm, a system alarm, the specific tone of the hospital's emergency operations alert. And then Fossey's voice in her earpiece. She'd handed Rebecca a temporary radio unit 2 hours ago, clipped to her collar, came through with the controlled urgency of someone delivering bad news efficiently. "Solis. Main server room, 2nd floor. Fire suppression system has been triggered. Someone is in the building's network infrastructure." Rebecca looked at Tully on the floor of the dark room. "The records," she said. "Your records. Are they physical or digital?" He stared at her. "Digital. On the hospital server. I uploaded them this morning before they get wiped," she said, and she was already moving. She moved fast, not running. Running in a hospital drew the wrong kind of attention, and she needed not to be stopped, but the kind of purposeful stride that medical staff use when every second counts, and panic is a luxury they can't afford. The stairwell at the end of the administrative wing was operating on backup lighting, the red-tinted emergency strips casting everything in the dim flat color of a building in crisis mode. She took the stairs 2 at a time. Behind her, she heard Fossey's voice again on the radio unit, relaying instructions to her team, coordinating coverage on the floor below, and Rebecca did the calculation as she climbed. 2nd floor server room. Fossey's team was on the ground floor and the administrative wing, which meant the 2nd floor was the gap. She hit the 2nd floor landing and pushed through the door. The main corridor was in backup lighting too, the primary fluorescents dark, the emergency strips doing their limited job. The server room was at the far end of the clinical administration section, behind a keycard access door she had never had reason to use before today. She was already thinking about that problem when she saw the door was standing open. Not kicked in, not forced, open. Which meant someone had access, either legitimate or obtained. She slowed as she approached, took the last 10 feet carefully, not because she was trained in tactical entry. She was, but that wasn't the relevant frame right now. But because walking into an unknown situation without information was how people got hurt, and she was not in a position to get hurt. She stopped at the doorframe and listened. Sounds from inside. The mechanical hum of servers, the cooling fans, and below those, movement. Deliberate, unhurried movement, the kind of someone who doesn't think they're being watched. She looked in. The server room was long and narrow, racks of equipment on both sides, indicator lights blinking in patterns that meant nothing to her clinically, but meant the systems were still running, which meant the intrusion hadn't finished what it started. At the far end, a figure was crouched in front of an open panel in the rack, a laptop connected to a port she didn't recognize the type of, fingers moving on the keyboard with practiced speed. The figure was a woman. Mid-30s, dark jacket, hair pulled back. She had not heard Rebecca at the door. Rebecca had about 4 seconds to make a decision. She was not armed. She was a nurse with a radio unit and a federal task force somewhere on the floors below her. The rational option was to pull back, relay the position, let Fosse's team handle it. She keyed the radio. "Server room, second floor," she said, her voice as low and flat as she could make it. "Occupied. Single individual, active at the rack. Need someone up here now." She heard Fosse's acknowledgement, heard the movement of the response. Estimated arrival, 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. She looked back into the server room. The woman at the rack had shifted. She was typing faster now, which meant she was either almost done or had heard something and was accelerating. Either way, 2 minutes was probably too long. Rebecca stepped into the server room. "Hospital security," she said, which was not true, but she wasn't going to announce what she actually was. "Step away from the equipment." The woman's hand stopped. She didn't turn around immediately, which was a calculation. Rebecca recognized it as a calculation, the half-second a person uses to assess their options. Then she stood and turned. She was not anyone Rebecca recognized. Her face was composed in the way that people's faces are composed when they've trained for high-pressure situations. But underneath it was the particular tension of someone whose plan had just encountered an unexpected variable. "This is a restricted access area," the woman said. Her accent was flat, regional, indeterminate. "I'm with Hospital IT." "Hospital IT," Rebecca said. "In the dark. During a mass casualty event. Emergency maintenance protocol." "Take your hands out of your pockets," Rebecca said. "Both of them." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she took her hands out of her jacket pockets. Both of them, empty. She let them hang at her sides. And then she did something Rebecca hadn't anticipated. She smiled briefly, the specific smile of someone adjusting their approach. "You're the nurse," the woman said. "Solis, Arroyo's person." "I'm not anyone's person." "That's a nice thing to believe." She glanced at the laptop still connected to the rack. "It's already done, by the way, whether you stop me or not." Rebecca heard footsteps in the corridor behind her, 2 sets, moving fast. "Step away from the rack," she said again. The woman stepped away from the rack, toward Rebecca, not away from her, which was wrong, and Rebecca registered it wrong in the same moment that the woman's hand came out of her left sleeve with something that was not a weapon, too small, and the shape was wrong. And then the stairwell door at the far end of the server room opened, and a second person entered from the other direction. 2 of them. She'd been watching one. Fosse's team came through the door behind her at that exact moment. 2 agents, fast and certain, and the dynamic in the room shifted with the speed of a current changing direction. The woman near the rack made a decision and moved toward the second entrance, and the second person tried to move through the room toward the laptop, and what happened in the next 40 seconds was not clean or organized. It was loud and physical, and involved the server racks getting partially displaced and a considerable amount of shouting and one of the agents going down briefly on one knee before getting back up. Rebecca pressed herself flat against the far wall and stayed out of the way because she had learned that the moments when federal agents are physically subduing someone are not the moments to be a helpful civilian moving around the room. Both individuals were restrained. The laptop was left in place. One of the agents stood over it without touching it, which meant evidence protocols were in effect. The agent who had gone to one knee was already on his feet and looked embarrassed rather than injured. Fosse came through the door 30 seconds later. She looked at the 2 people on the floor, looked at the laptop, looked at Rebecca against the wall. "You went in without backup," she said. "I announced myself and requested backup simultaneously," Rebecca said. "I didn't go hands-on." "You could have—" "I know what I could have," Rebecca said. "I needed 90 more seconds on that laptop. I bought them." Fosse looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at her team. "Get the digital forensics kit up here. Nobody touches that machine." She came to stand beside Rebecca against the wall while her team worked. Her voice dropped. "The woman accessed the server for approximately 4 minutes before you engaged her. We don't know yet what she got to. We have an IT forensics unit coming, but they're 40 minutes out." "She said it was already done," Rebecca said. Fosse absorbed that. "She was trying to rattle you." "Maybe. Or she was telling the truth." "Both can be true," Fosse said. "We'll know in 40 minutes. They went back downstairs. The hospital had not stopped operating during any of this. That was the thing that struck Rebecca as she came back through the clinical areas. The ER was still running, the patients were still there. The nurses and residents and orderlies were still moving through the department doing the work that the building existed to do. The grid had been restored to primary power 8 minutes after the failure, which meant whatever the woman in the server room had actually done or not done, the building's clinical systems had not been compromised in any operational way. She did a round. Not because she'd been gone long, but because a round was what you did. Yusuf Adara was in the OR. The surgery, according to the board, was progressing. Rogelio Ferris's oxygen saturation had improved. Gus had woken up and was asking about his wife. Petra had been moved to a step-down room and was asking about her husband, which Rebecca took as a positive sign because you don't ask logistical questions when you're deteriorating. Otto Garfield, not her patient, had never been her patient technically, was in a cardiac step-down unit on the 3rd floor. She hadn't checked on him since this morning. She detoured upstairs. He was awake. He looked better than he had any right to, given that he had been dead for approximately 6 minutes before the code team brought him back. He was watching something on his phone with the screen turned low, and he looked up when she appeared at the door. "You're the one who flagged it," he said. He'd apparently been told. "I ordered the ECG," she said. "The team brought you back." "Don't do that," he said. Not ungratefully, but firmly. "Don't do the thing where you give all the credit away." She looked at him for a moment. "How are you feeling?" "Like I died and came back, which apparently I did." He set the phone down. "They said there's some kind of situation in the hospital. Federal agents. Is that connected to—" "Mr. Garfield," she said. "Rest. That's the most useful thing you can do right now." "I was asking because I wanted to know if you were okay," he said. "Not because I was being nosy." She stopped at the door. It was an unexpectedly direct thing for a patient she barely knew to say, and it landed on her in a way she hadn't been prepared for, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. A man she'd helped that morning asking if she was okay. The simplicity of it. "I'm still standing," she said. "Good," he said. "That counts." She went back downstairs. The afternoon had moved into early evening without her fully tracking the transition. The ER had settled into the steady operational rhythm of a department that had absorbed a mass casualty event and was now managing the aftermath. The kind of work that didn't have the adrenaline of the acute phase, but was arguably harder because the energy was gone and the patients were still there. She worked the rhythm. She checked the board, checked her patients, answered questions, corrected one documentation issue that would have created a billing problem and a patient safety flag simultaneously, and tried not to think about the server room and what may or may not have been extracted from Tully's uploaded records. She was at the nursing station when Dee Dee appeared beside her. "You need to come look at something," Dee Dee said. The something was on the break room television, which someone had turned to the local news. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Federal investigation at Callaway Regional. Multiple arrests made." The reporter was standing in the hospital parking lot, and behind her Rebecca could see the news van that had been there since mid-morning, which meant the story had been developing since early afternoon and someone had finally given the green light to air it. The segment was thin on specifics, the way breaking news stories are when the legal situation is still active. But it showed the exterior of the hospital. It named Callaway Regional explicitly, and it referenced, without naming him, a senior hospital administrator being held in connection with a federal fraud investigation. The break room had 4 people in it, all of them watching the screen. None of them were speaking. Rebecca watched for 30 seconds and left. She found Arroyo in the second-floor conference room. He was on a phone call, but he ended it when she came in. He looked the way he looked at the end of long operations. Not exhausted exactly, but compressed, like a person who has been running at high intensity for a sustained period and is managing the descent carefully. "The server room," she said. "Partially successful intrusion," he said. "The forensics team arrived 20 minutes ago. They're working through what was accessed. Tully's records, among other data. We're not certain of the scope yet." He paused. "The 2 individuals apprehended up there are not talking. Their documentation is fabricated, which we identified inside of an hour. We're running their biometrics now." "And Voss?" "In federal custody." He said it with the particular flatness of someone delivering information he's been waiting to deliver for a long time. "His attorney arrived an hour ago. He's not talking either, but his records are." She sat down, which she hadn't done in what felt like most of the day. The chair was functional and uncomfortable and exactly right. You said records. The warrant covered the administrative offices, his personal devices, and the hospital financial systems. Our forensic accountants have been working the financial data since mid-afternoon. What they're finding is, he stopped, chose his words, extensive. Meaning? Meaning the Meridian connection wasn't limited to his prior consulting work. Meridian has been processing payments through a series of intermediary vendors that contract with this hospital's supply chain. Inflated invoices, the same methodology as the original scheme you documented. They adapted after your original report created scrutiny, moved the mechanism, kept the function. He set his hands flat on the table. This hospital has been a processing node in that system for approximately 22 months. 22 months. Almost the entirety of Voss's tenure. The board members who facilitated his appointment, she said, 2 of them are being contacted by federal investigators today. A third has apparently already retained counsel. He looked at her. The person who brought Voss here knew exactly what they were building. The hospital was chosen deliberately, regional, under-resourced for oversight, with a patient population that included significant federal insurance coverage, which generated regular interface with military medical procurement systems. And I was here, she said. Yes. He held her gaze. Your presence here was... He paused. We don't believe it was accidental that you were here. The Delwood position was posted approximately 4 months after the network identified you as a potential risk. The posting was designed to attract your profile. We believe you were guided here. The room was quiet. She'd come to Delwood because it was small and quiet and nobody knew her name. She'd come because it was the opposite of everything she'd been trying to leave. She'd thought the choice was hers. They needed me contained, she said. They needed you where they could watch you, somewhere they had institutional control, somewhere that, if you started asking questions again, they had the mechanisms to remove you quickly. He paused, which they used this morning. When I started asking questions again, she said, about the billing discrepancies. Yes. She sat with this for a moment, not with the anger. The anger was there, but it wasn't useful yet, but with the shape of it, the architecture. The amount of efforts that had gone into keeping her quiet, keeping her manageable, keeping her in a building they controlled. And she'd come back this morning. Through the door they'd just closed behind her, into the building they thought they owned. She almost laughed, which would have been inappropriate, and she didn't. But the almost was there. The explosion, she said. Route 9. Still under active investigation. What we can say at this point is that the facility was used for component storage connected to Meridian's logistics network. The explosion destroyed significant physical evidence. Whether that was the primary purpose or a secondary benefit, we're still determining. Tevin Marsh, she said, is he protected? He's in federal protective custody and will remain so through the investigation. His account, combined with the forensic evidence that survived the blast, is sufficient to establish the deliberate nature of the incident. Arroyo paused. His testimony is going to matter. She nodded. She thought about Tevin Marsh on the 287 in his truck, deciding who to call, deciding to call the nurse who came back. She thought about Darnell from Transport, who had given Tevin her number because she'd helped him with his mother's discharge paperwork 2 years ago. The whole thing had turned on the smallest decisions. She stood up. I should go back to the floor. Rebecca. He used her first name, which he almost never did even when they'd served together. She stopped. Your separation from the service 8 years ago, the record, the formal notation of the circumstances. He looked at her steadily. We're filing a correction. It'll go through official channels, take some time, but the documentation is being prepared. What was in your record was false. It's going to be corrected. She looked at him. He had the expression of someone who had prepared themselves for this moment to go multiple ways and wasn't entirely sure which way it was going. Thank you, she said. It came out smaller than it probably should have, but it was genuine, and genuine was the most she had. She went back to the floor. The next hour was quiet, comparatively. She worked. The board cleared slowly. Cade Mercer found her near Bay 4 and handed her a coffee from the vending machine. Not great coffee, the kind that comes out of hospital machines and tastes like the memory of coffee, without preamble or fanfare. You don't have to do that, she said. I know. he said. I wanted to. He looked at the floor for a moment. For what it's worth, today, watching you work, I came into this residency thinking I understood what good medicine looked like. You still do, she said. I understand it differently now, he said. That's what I mean. She drank the coffee. It was exactly as bad as expected, and she was glad for it. Dee Dee came to find her at 7:15. There's a press situation developing outside, Dee Dee said. More news vans. The federal people put out a statement in the last hour. What did the statement say? I saw it on my phone. Dee Dee searched for the word. It's specific. More specific than I expected this fast. Rebecca looked at her. Show me. Dee Dee handed her the phone. The statement was from the federal task force, brief and formal, and it contained the name Harlan Voss and the name Meridian Defense Partners, and the phrase ongoing investigation, and the phrase multiple individuals taken into federal custody today, and the phrase additional charges pending. It did not contain her name. She handed the phone back. Are you okay? Dee Dee asked. It was the second time today someone had asked her that. Getting there, she said, which was more honest than yes and more useful than a longer answer. She was back at the nursing station at 7:43 when Fossey appeared. The agent looked like someone who had been running at operational pace since morning and had no intention of stopping, but was also human and showed it slightly around the edges. The server room intrusion, Fossey said. Forensics completed the initial analysis. Rebecca waited. Tully's records were accessed. Portions of them were copied before you interrupted the intrusion. She paused. However, Tully uploaded a second set of records this morning. Separate location, separate file architecture, different credentials. He used a guest physician account that isn't linked to his name in the directory. Fossey's expression was the closest thing to satisfaction Rebecca had seen on her face all day. The intrusion team accessed the primary account. They missed the secondary. The complete record set is intact. Rebecca let out a breath she'd been carrying since the server room. How complete, mate? She said. 2 years of documentation. Financial records, communication logs, internal memos. A billing analysis he apparently compiled himself over approximately 18 months. The man kept records the way someone keeps records when they know they're going to need them. Fossey paused. His attorney contacted us an hour ago. He wants to cooperate. Tully wants to cooperate. In exchange for consideration on the charges he's facing. Yes. She paused. Whether he gets it depends on what he has and how he delivers it. But what he has, based on what we've seen in those records, she looked directly at Rebecca. It goes above Voss. Significantly above. Rebecca understood what that meant. The network didn't end at a hospital CMO in Delwood, Wyoming. It didn't end at a regional consulting arrangement. It went somewhere above, into the architecture of the original scheme, into the people who had signed off on burying her original report, into the ranks of the people who had ended her military career. She was careful about how she felt about that. Hope was an expensive thing to spend early. When does it move? She said. The federal filing is being prepared now. Arrests on the extended network will roll out over the next 72 hours. It's coordinated. Multiple jurisdictions, multiple agencies. Fossey paused. Once it's filed, it becomes public record, the full scope. Including the original suppression of my report, Rebecca said. Including that. Fossey held her gaze. Including the names of the individuals responsible. The nursing station was quiet around them. The monitors beeped their steady rhythms. The overhead PA called a floor extension in the department above. The ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of a hospital functioning. She'd spent 8 years waiting for someone to say those words. She hadn't let herself want it too directly, hadn't let herself calculate what it would mean when it happened. Because wanting things too directly when you're in a situation you can't control is how you damage yourself in ways that don't heal cleanly. But standing at the nursing station of a hospital in Wyoming, at the end of the longest day she could remember, she felt something shift in the space where she'd been carrying the weight of it. Okay, she said. There's one more thing, Fossey said. Her voice had changed slightly. The 2 individuals from the server room, biometric identification came back an hour ago. Rebecca waited. The woman is a contractor, private security, connected to a logistics firm that's been on the task force's radar for 14 months. She paused. The man who entered from the secondary stairwell is a different matter. What kind of different matter? Fosse looked at her with the careful expression of someone about to close a very old loop. His name is Gerrit Lund, she said. He was an intelligence officer with the Military Logistics Oversight Division. He left the service under administrative separation 6 years ago, after an internal review that was, we now believe, staged to protect him from a broader inquiry. The name meant nothing to her. The role did. He was in the Oversight Division, Rebecca said slowly. He was the individual responsible for reviewing your original report before it was forwarded to your commanding officer, Fosse said. Based on the documentation we've been assembling, we believe he was the first point of contact between your report and the Meridian Network. He was the one who identified you as a risk. He was the one who set the sequence in motion that ended your career. The monitor at the nurses' station beeped. Someone down the hall called a question and got an answer. The hospital breathed around her. She looked at Fosse and did not say anything for a moment because there was no sentence that adequately covered what it felt like to learn that the man who had dismantled her professional life, who had set her on a path that ended in a small city in Wyoming being walked out of a building with a cardboard box, had today been arrested on the floor above the emergency room she'd spent the day keeping alive. He's in custody, she said. Since 4 this afternoon, Fosse said. He's not going anywhere. She nodded, looked at the board, looked at the remaining patient names, the tasks left to complete, the ordinary structure of a shift winding toward its end. She picked up a chart. She was halfway through the notation when Dee Dee appeared at her elbow, and Dee Dee's expression was the specific one she wore when something had happened that she didn't know how to categorize. There's someone at the main entrance, Dee Dee said, asking for you specifically. Who? He says his name is Philip Rourke. He says he's on the Callaway Regional Board of Directors. Dee Dee paused. He came with an attorney, and he's been standing there for about 10 minutes. He looks... She seemed to search for the right word. He looks like a man who got very bad news and came to find out how bad it is. Rebecca set the chart down. A board member. Not the administrator, not the physician. A board member, arriving at the hospital in the evening with an attorney, asking for the nurse they'd suspended this morning. She thought about what Arroyo had said. 3 board members being contacted by investigators, one of whom had already retained counsel. This man had come here before the investigators reached him, or possibly just after. He'd come to the hospital instead of to a federal office. He'd asked for her by name. She didn't yet know what he wanted. She didn't know if it was a negotiation attempt or a warning or something she hadn't thought of yet. She didn't know if he was the board member who had facilitated Voss's appointment or one of the others who had watched it happen. What she knew was that a man with institutional power and a lawyer was standing at the entrance of her hospital asking for her, and that the shape of that, at the end of this particular day, was something she needed to understand before she decided what to do with it. Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes, she said. Dee Dee looked at her. Should I call Agent Fosse? Rebecca thought about it for exactly 1 second. Yes, she said. Do that first. She finished the notation on the chart. She set it down clean. She straightened up and looked at the ER around her, the patients, the staff, the monitors, the board. And then she started walking toward the main entrance. Whatever Philip Rourke had come to say, she was going to hear it standing up. Philip Rourke was 63, the kind of man who had spent decades in rooms where decisions got made and had developed the particular posture of someone accustomed to being listened to. He was wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and he had brought an attorney who stood slightly behind him in the way that attorneys stand when they're there as a presence rather than a participant. He saw Rebecca coming across the lobby, and something shifted in his face. Not relief, not hostility. Something more complicated than either. Fosse was 2 steps behind Rebecca. Rourke saw the agent and his jaw tightened, but he didn't leave. That told her something. Ms. Solis, he said. Mr. Rourke. She stopped 6 feet from him. She didn't offer her hand. You came a long way to talk to a nurse. He absorbed that. I came because... He glanced at Fosse, then back. Because I was told this morning about the investigation scope, and I want to be clear about what I knew and what I didn't. That's a conversation for Agent Fossey, Rebecca said. I'm aware of that. I've already called the task force. He paused. I came here because I wanted to say something directly to you, before the legal process takes over everything and makes every human interaction into a deposition. Rebecca waited. I voted against Voss's appointment, Rourke said. I want you to know that. It was 3-2 on the board. I was on the losing side. He looked at her with the steady gaze of someone who had decided honesty was the only remaining option. I didn't know the specifics of what he was connected to, but I knew he was the wrong person for this hospital, and I didn't push hard enough when I lost the vote. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility anymore. He stopped. People got hurt because of what happened in this building today. People got hurt before today, in ways I'm still learning about. I own a piece of that. The lobby was quiet around them. The evening staff moving in the background, a family near the information desk, the ambient hum of a hospital at 7 in the evening. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you're the person who came back, he said. When they threw you out, you came back. I wanted to look you in the eye and acknowledge that the institution you came back to save didn't deserve it. She said nothing for a moment. The attorney behind him was very still. No, she said finally. It didn't. She paused. But the patients did. That's why I came back. Something crossed Rourke's face. Not quite absolution, which wasn't hers to give, and she wasn't offering, but something that looked like a man accepting the distinction and understanding it. Agent Fossey will need your cooperation, Rebecca said. Full cooperation. Everything you know, everything you suspected, everything you told yourself wasn't your responsibility. Yes, he said. I know. She left him with Fossey and went back to her patients. She worked until 10:15. She had not been scheduled past 7, had in fact been suspended for the first half of her own shift, and nobody in any official capacity had told her to stay. She stayed because Yusuf Adara came out of surgery at 9:40, and his first post-operative hour was the one that mattered most, and she wasn't going to leave that to a department still running at reduced capacity. She stayed because Cade Mercer was on until midnight, and she'd spent the day turning him into something better than he'd been at 8 in the morning, and she wanted to make sure he finished the shift standing. She stayed because it was her hospital, even when they told her it wasn't, and she had never been good at leaving things unfinished. Adara's post-op vitals were stable. His pressure held. His wife Delia, who had arrived at the hospital at 4 in the afternoon and had been waiting in the surgical family area for nearly 6 hours, was finally allowed back. Rebecca watched them for a moment from the doorway, Delia's hand covering her husband's, the specific quiet of two people who have just been given more time, and then she moved on. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room at 10:20. She was pulling her jacket on when Cade Mercer knocked on the open door. Heading out? He said. Finally, she said. He leaned against the doorframe. He'd been running on his own version of empty for hours, and it showed, but there was something in his face that hadn't been there this morning. A steadiness, maybe. The kind that comes from finding out what you're made of and discovering it's enough. I looked you up, he said. After the general arrived. I looked up your record, the old one. He paused. There wasn't much. A gap, and then a discharge notation that didn't... He stopped. It didn't match what I watched you do today. Records get things wrong sometimes, she said. I know that now. He was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something, and you can tell me it's none of my business? Ask. Was it worth it? Coming back here today, after what they did to you this morning? She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. Not the reflexive answer, not the professional one. Otto Garfield's alive, she said. Yusuf Adara made it through surgery. The people who spent years hiding what they did are in federal custody. She pulled her jacket straight. Yeah, it was worth it. He nodded slowly. I think I want to be the kind of doctor who would have come back, he said. I'm not sure I would have. I need to be honest about that. You didn't leave, she said. When everything went sideways today, you stayed and you worked. That counts. She left him standing in the doorway and walked out into the night. The parking lot was different at 10:20 than it had been at 9 in the morning. The news vans were still there. Two of them, positioned near the main entrance, lights on for evening broadcasts. A federal vehicle she didn't recognize was parked near the administrative entrance. The air had the cold bite of a Wyoming night pushing toward late autumn, and it smelled like weather coming, the clean, particular smell of altitude and distance. She stood beside her truck for a moment. She'd been standing in this parking lot 12 hours ago with a cardboard box on the hood. She'd looked at the sky then, too. Same sky, different shape of the day. She got in and drove. She didn't go straight home. She drove out past the city limit onto Route 12, the one that cut north through the high plains, and she drove it for 20 minutes in the dark, with the radio off and the heater running and the road empty in front of her. Not because she had somewhere to be, because she needed the space between the day and whatever came after it, and this was how she'd always made that space, moving through the dark, the engine's hum, the specific quiet of being in between. She thought about Arroyo saying, "Your record is going to be corrected." She thought about what that meant in practical terms. The paperwork, the official channels, the formal language of institutional acknowledgement. She thought about how much of herself she'd built around carrying the absence of it. The thing that had been taken from her, the career and the rank and the standing, and what she'd constructed in its place, which was quieter and smaller and harder to take because it didn't depend on anyone's authorization. She thought about the woman she'd been at 30, filing a report that she believed the system would honor. She thought about the woman she'd been at 38, walking out of a hospital in Wyoming with a cardboard box. She thought about the woman she was now, driving home at the end of a day that had cracked something open. She turned around at mile marker 22 and drove back. The next 2 weeks moved the way consequential things move. Not smoothly, not dramatically, but with the grinding procedural weight of institutions being held to account, which is slower and less cinematic than it sounds, and more permanent than it feels. Harlan Voss was formally charged on day 3. Fraud, conspiracy, abuse of institutional authority, and 3 additional charges that the federal filing specified in language that the news outlet simplified into corruption at a regional hospital connected to a decade-long defense contracting scheme. His mugshot ran on the regional news and on 2 national outlets that picked up the story. He did not look like the man who had stood in the hallway with crossed arms and satisfied authority. He looked like what he was, a man who had believed for a long time that his position was structural and permanent, discovering that it was neither. Garrett Lund was charged in a separate but coordinated filing. His charges included conspiracy, obstruction, and specific counts related to the suppression of the original procurement fraud report, the report Rebecca had filed 11 years ago, the report that had started all of it. His name appeared in the federal court documents, accompanied by a description of his role that was precise and damning, and, for the people who understood what it meant, a very long time coming. Meridian Defense Partners was named as a corporate defendant in a civil federal action that froze significant assets within the first week. The firm's network of intermediary vendors was identified in a supplementary filing that ran to 67 pages. The 2 individuals from the server room were identified as contractors in Meridian's private security arm and charged accordingly. The plant explosion on Route 9 was formally classified as deliberate on day 5. Tevin Marsh's testimony, combined with the forensic evidence that had survived the blast and the records recovered from Tully's secondary server upload, provided the evidentiary basis for that classification and for the additional charges it generated. Tevin gave his formal statement from protective custody and sounded, in the brief clip that aired on local news, like a man who had decided that what he saw was his to report, regardless of what it cost him. Rebecca watched the clip once and didn't watch it again because once was enough to know what it was. Marcus Tully's cooperation agreement was finalized on day 8. He received reduced charges in exchange for full testimony and the complete handover of his documentation. His medical license was suspended pending the outcome of the proceedings. He would likely lose it permanently. Rebecca didn't feel satisfaction about that. She'd worked alongside Tully for 4 years, had disagreed with him, and been dismissed by him, and she now understood been used by institutions he was embedded in without his full understanding of the machinery. What she felt was something more complicated and less clean than satisfaction. More like the recognition that accountability doesn't distribute itself according to culpability the way you want it to. and that sometimes the people who were tools bear the weight alongside the people who use them. And there's nothing just about that except that the alternative, no accountability at all, is worse. Nora Ingram was not charged. The federal investigation determined that her reporting to Voss had been manipulated, that she had been told she was participating in an employee performance process and had no knowledge of the network her information was feeding. She was placed on administrative leave by the interim hospital management and returned to her position 30 days later. The day she came back, she found Rebecca in the break room and stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and found that rehearsal didn't help. "I don't expect you to," she started. "Sit down," Rebecca said. Nora sat. "You got used," Rebecca said, "by someone with more information than you had and more willingness to cause harm. That's what happened." She paused. "You also should have told me directly instead of going around me. That part is true too." "I know." "So we carry both things," Rebecca said, "and we work." Nora looked at her for a long moment. "Just like that?" "Not just like that," Rebecca said honestly, "but yeah." Rourke had given full cooperation to the federal investigation. The board's complicit members, 2 of them, as it turned out, with the third having limited but documented involvement, were removed and referred for civil and criminal proceedings. The board itself was reconstituted under interim governance authority while the institutional review proceeded. Rourke retained his seat by virtue of his documented opposition to Voss's appointment and his voluntary cooperation, which was a legal outcome, and not necessarily a moral one, but legal and moral don't always arrive at the same destination at the same time. The formal correction to Rebecca's military record was completed on day 11. It arrived not as a ceremony, but as a document. Official letterhead, specific language, the administrative reversal of the false notations that had been entered 8 years ago. Arroyo called her when it was finalized. "It's done," he said. She was at the nursing station when she took the call. Bay 4 was running a patient transfer. The board had 7 names on it. Dee Dee was doing intake at the far end. The ordinary machinery of the department was operating around her. "Okay," she said. "That's all you've got?" "What do you want me to say, David?" He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to say it matters." "It matters," she said, and then, because he'd earned the rest of it, "It matters more than I know how to say in a hospital corridor at 2 in the afternoon. I'll figure out how to say it properly later." She heard him exhale. "Fair enough," he said. She went back to work. On day 19, the interim hospital administrator called her into the office that had been Voss's and was now occupied by a woman named Dr. Sandra Osei, brought in from a hospital oversight body to manage Callaway Regional through the transition period. Osei was 51, direct, and had the particular energy of someone who had been sent into difficult situations before and had no patience for anything that wasn't functional. She offered Rebecca the position of interim nursing director of emergency services. Rebecca looked at her across the desk. "Why me?" "Because you ran this ER through a mass casualty event on the worst day this institution has had in 2 decades, and you did it while suspended, with a federal investigation unfolding around you, and the department is still functional." Osei paused. "And because the staff asked for you." "Who asked?" Dee Dee Flores submitted a formal recommendation the day after the incident, signed by 14 of the clinical staff, including 3 residents. Osei folded her hands on the desk. Dr. Mercer's name was on it. Rebecca looked at the desk. The window behind Osei showed the parking lot. The same parking lot, different version of the day. "It's interim," she said. "For now, the permanent position will go through proper process. But interim means you have the authority to do the work that needs doing while the institution rebuilds." Osei paused. "Which is considerable." "I know," Rebecca said. "I've been here for 4 years." "Is that a yes?" She thought about what she'd told Arroyo, standing in the conference room on the worst morning of the year. "I'm here because people are dying." She thought about Otto Garfield saying that counts. She thought about what she'd wanted when she came to Delwood. The quiet, the anonymity, the idea that helping people could be enough without the weight of everything else that came with her. She thought about what actually happened when you tried to make yourself small in a space that needed you to be large. Yes, she said. The work of rebuilding was not glamorous. It was meetings and policy revisions and difficult conversations with staff who had spent weeks in the aftermath of an institutional rupture trying to figure out who to trust and how to function. It was identifying the supply chain discrepancies that Voss's network had introduced into the hospital's procurement and untangling them line by line. It was sitting across from the new medical director and making the case twice for a nursing advocacy protocol that gave clinical staff a formal escalation pathway when physician decisions raised patient safety concerns. She made that case until she won it. It took 3 weeks and 2 drafts and 1 meeting where she put 6 documented case studies on the table, including Otto Garfield's, and said quietly, "These are the patients we almost lost because the system didn't have a mechanism for this." Nobody argued with her after that. She restructured the triage flow in the emergency department, eliminating a bottleneck that had existed since the department's last renovation and that every nurse on the floor knew about, and nobody had ever put formally in writing. She created a cross-training protocol between the ED nurses and the step-down unit that the charge nurses on both floors had been requesting for 2 years without traction. She pushed through a documentation system update that reduced the error rate on medication orders by implementing a double verification step that added 45 seconds per order and prevented the kind of mistake she'd caught during the mass casualty event. She did not do any of it perfectly. She miscalculated the resistance to the new triage flow from one of the senior attendings and had to revisit the implementation. She drafted a staff communication about the institutional review that came out too formal and had to rewrite it in plain language after Dee Dee told her, directly and without softening it, that it sounded like a press release rather than a person. She made a scheduling decision in week 3 that she had to reverse in week 4 because it didn't account for a shift coverage pattern she'd underestimated. She made the mistakes and corrected them and kept going because that was what the work was, not the absence of error, but the presence of correction. 6 weeks after the incident, the federal court filings went into their next phase. The hearing was public record. Voss appeared before a federal magistrate in Cheyenne and entered a plea that his attorneys had negotiated over the preceding weeks. Guilty on 4 of 7 counts, cooperation on the remainder. The sentencing date was set for 8 months out. The summary of the agreed statement of facts, which became public on the day of the hearing, laid out in clear procedural language what Voss had done and for how long and who had benefited. The document named Meridian Defense Partners 37 times. It named the board members 11 times. It named Garrett Lund 14 times. It described the original suppression of the procurement fraud report, Rebecca's report, in 2 specific paragraphs that used the phrase deliberate misrepresentation of source credibility and the phrase retaliatory administrative action. It did not name her in the summary. Her name was in the underlying case documents, which were available for those who looked. She didn't need to be in the summary. The day the hearing summary was released, she was in the middle of a shift. She read it on her phone during a 10-minute break, standing in the corridor outside the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold. She read both paragraphs about the suppression twice. She folded her phone and put it in her pocket and finished the coffee and went back to the floor. That evening, after the shift, she drove out on Route 12 again. Same road, same darkness, same smell of the high plains at the edge of autumn turning into winter. She drove to mile marker 22 again, which had become, without her planning it, the place she went to complete things. She sat there for a while with the engine running. She thought about the woman she'd been at 30, filing a report because it was right. 30-year-old Rebecca Solis had not been naive. She'd known the military was a complicated institution with complicated priorities. But she had believed, at the specific molecular level of personal conviction, that documenting the truth was the thing you did regardless of what it cost. She'd done it. It had cost her everything she'd built. She'd spent 8 years building different things and different materials, quieter things, less visible things, things that couldn't be taken by a notation in a record. The 4 years at Callaway Regional had been part of that construction, small, daily, unglamorous. A hand on a patient's arm, a number that didn't look right, a question asked in a corridor that nobody else thought to ask. The 30-year-old woman who filed the report and the 38-year-old woman who came back through the door. They were the same woman. That was what she understood now, sitting at mile marker 22, that she had not always been able to see clearly. The years between hadn't diminished her. They tested whether the conviction was structural or situational, whether the impulse to do right was conditional on being recognized for it. It wasn't. It never had been. She turned the truck around and drove back toward Delwood. 2 months later, Otto Garfield was discharged from his final cardiac follow-up appointment. He walked out through the main entrance of Callaway Regional Medical Center in a jacket that was slightly too big for him. He'd lost weight during recovery, and his wife was waiting for him with the car. Rebecca happened to be crossing the lobby when he came through. He saw her and stopped. His wife looked between them and had the good sense to say nothing. "I keep thinking about what I'd be doing right now if you hadn't flagged it," Otto said. "Don't do that to yourself," she said. "I'm not doing it badly," he said. It changed some things. How I think about time." He paused. "Are you okay here? Now that everything—" "Yeah," she said. "I'm good." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something more and settled for extending his hand, which she shook. His grip was firm and a little awkward in the way that people's grips are when they're trying to put something larger than a handshake into a handshake. She watched him walk out to his wife and the car and the afternoon. She stood in the lobby for a moment. Here is what she knew about the years ahead. They would not be simple. The institutional damage at Callaway Regional would take longer to repair than anyone's timeline suggested. The federal proceedings would drag on in the way federal proceedings drag on, with delays and continuances and the slow procedural grinding of accountability. Her record had been corrected on paper, but the people who had known her before and after would carry their own versions of events, and those versions would not always match the official correction. She would make more mistakes in the director role and have to correct more of them. The work would be hard and sometimes thankless and occasionally maddening. None of that changed the basic arithmetic. She had come back through a door they closed behind her. She had worked while they watched and waited for her to fail. She had documented and refused to unsee and stayed in her lane while defining for herself where her lane actually ran. And the thing about people who spend years trying to make you smaller is that they operate on the assumption that your size is theirs to determine, that the institution owns the measure of you, that the badge is the authority rather than the person carrying it. They're wrong about this. They're always wrong about this. It just takes longer than it should for the correction to arrive. She turned away from the lobby doors and walked back toward the ER, where the board had 5 names on it and Dee Dee was running intake and Cade Mercer was somewhere in the department doing the work that would make him into the doctor he was going to be. Where a department that had been through the worst thing it had experienced in 2 decades was slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly rebuilding itself. She pushed through the doors. "Charge nurse says we've got a trauma incoming," Dee Dee said without looking up. "ETA 6 minutes. "What's the mechanism?" Rebecca said, already moving toward the bay. "Vehicle rollover on the 287, driver conscious, but—" "Okay." She was already gloved, already thinking through the sequence, already the person that the room reorganized around. "Let's go." The monitor beeped. The department breathed. Outside, the sky over Delwood was doing something spectacular with the late afternoon light that nobody inside had time to look at. She didn't look either. She had work to do. The most important thing she had ever learned, in the field, in the years between, in the long months of being nobody in a place that needed her to be someone, was that strength doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't need a title or a badge or a superior's signature on a form. It operates in the present tense, in the room you're actually in, with the resources actually in front of you. They had taken everything from her that could be taken, and she had kept going. Not because she was exceptional, because she refused to let what they took define what remained. That's not a story about one woman in one hospital in Wyoming. That's the story of anyone who ever kept going after someone decided they were done. The trauma team assembled, the bay doors opened, the gurney came through. She stepped forward.